Hello and a very warm welcome to everyone joining today's webinar titled Commercial Readiness in Light of In Vitro Diagnostic Regulation. My name is Thomas Casburn and I'll be moderating today's session. In today's webinar, I'm delighted to be joined once again by three leaders in the field of in vitro diagnostics who will be sharing their expertise on how to be commercially ready for the new regulation. Kicking off today's presentation will be Dr. Julian Senak, the Global Director of the IVD Focus Team at TUSAD. Dr. Senak has more than 10 years of experience in biomedical research, including with a certification body where he participated with the preparation of IVD designation. In today's webinar, Julian will be delivering a short presentation covering IVD classification under the new regulation. Our second speaker is Eric Vollebrecht. Eric is a founding partner of the life sciences niche firm Axon Lawyers in Amsterdam, and he has more than 20 years of legal and regulatory experience in EU and Dutch national life sciences regulation. In his talk, Eric will be covering the new responsibilities of economic operators, as well as the impact of Brexit on this transition. Our final speaker is Sue Spencer, Head of IVD and a Principal Consultant at QServe. Sue has over 30 years of experience in the medical device and IVD industries, and in today's session, Sue will be examining the impact of IVD on different product portfolios, including research use only and general lab use IVDs. Without further delay, I'd like to hand over to Julian to begin today's presentation.
Hello, and now let's talk about the impact of this new device classification under the IVDR that will make a revolution to the world of IVD. The first element I really want to bring is going back to the definition on an IVD. It's very important to understand what the IVD is about, so then we understand how to deal with the classification. So, in vitro diagnostic could be reagent or software or kits that can be used alone or in combination. This is very important, but also it has to be intended by the manufacturer. So you are, as a manufacturer, in the driver's seat to decide what your device is used for and use in combination or not. But more importantly, it doesn't stop here. It has to be for a certain purpose. And the purpose that your device is used for will be one of those 6 elements. So, example, if you have a reagent that is used in a panel to determine cancer, by itself, it doesn't determine cancer. We understand that. However, you are intended to use it within the panel for this determination, and that determination is basically one of these 6 elements, right? Maybe the pathological process or states or physiological states or the predisposition to a disease or some elements like that. So this is something to keep in mind because you need to define clearly what your IVD is about. The next thing we will have to understand is how does classification work. We have today the IVDD. It's simple. You're in a list, you're list A or list B, or you're a self-test. You need to have an interaction with a notified body to get your CE mark pre-market. Otherwise, you self-declare and you go in the market whenever you're in compliance with the directive. Tomorrow, with the regulation, we have a lot of chapter and article to explain to us how things will work. The Annex 8 is almost the most important. It has 2 sets: implementing rule, classification rule, and that show you how you have to understand and process your product. And you end up in one of the 4 new classes, going from A to D, from low risk to high risk. Self-test will be found, in B and C. Companion diagnostic will be found in C, and near patient tests could be found any B, C, or D, as they are basically used for classified in their own right and not specific to a class. So when we know that, now we're moving to classification. And it all starts with intended purpose. I think this, if I have one thing for you guys to remember, intended purpose is the key. So it all starts with intended purpose, and from there, you add a few implementing rules. Those implementing rules are fairly simple, as like, for example, you have 2 rules that apply, take the highest class, controls and calibrators will be in the same as the device, and so on and so forth. And when you've done with that, you go for rule 1. Does that apply to me? Yes, then you become a D. But if no, then you go to rule 2 and so on all the way to the end. Very important to go through the entire process of all the rules so you know all the ones that are applicable to you, even if you find a high class already covering you. But now let's talk about this real impact. Today, when we have a survey asked to manufacturer, they say out of the 100% of their portfolio, less than 10%, or let's say around 10%, will be certified under the IVDD. The rest is self-declare. When we look at tomorrow on their same portfolio, they basically show going all the way up to 70% or more, and then the rest being self-declare or being discontinued. Because yes, there is one way that it's so much work and investment to move a product to certification that some of those products will be probably removed from the market. But still, the increase is real from 10% to 70%. What this look like for your device? And I think this is a very important point. Usually, if you have a list A, high chance that you will become a class D. If you have a list B, if you have a list B, you will move to be a class D on some cases, or a class C on most cases. For example, now in the class D, we find up-classified the anti-Duffy, the anti-Kid that were list B, but we also find some that are self-declared today, like syphilis, Chagas, that moving from no interaction to the full-on interaction with batch release and so on of the class D. If you look at the class C, the biomarkers, a lot of them will be up-classified to class C because today only PSA is in the list. CDX are there, and genetic tests will also fall onto C. When you look at the self-test, it's a split, I won't say 50-50, but almost. Some of them will be class C, some of them will be class B. And then when I put in class B all over self-declared device, is because if you're not falling into the class A today, which is a self-declared one, you will be at least in the B. So that means a lot of products that have to be revised. What is important is to define the right classification. In that case, interpretation is key, and the guidance have been issued last year, at the end of last year, to help you to better understand the rule. I really advise everyone to go through that. That would be very helpful to be sure that you put your device in the right class. And also, do not forget about the software. We have a guidance on the classification of software. This is some new concept. Now software could be a medical device. What is, however, a non-impact? It's an impact, but non-specific to the class. It's the plan for all your device. Very, very important. You have a lot of new plan or more in-depth plan. I'm thinking of performance evaluation plan, a performance study plan if needed, or the post-market follow-up plan, and so on. We also have a lot set of new reports. So these are non-classification related, but very important as one of the impact of the IVDR. So you can see them. I won't go through all of them, but that's the idea. At the end of the day, what should I do next with my portfolio? We saw where we have a lot of devices that change and become a class D or classified. So the first thing first, look at all your product and determine the one you want to maintain on the market. That's one point. The second one, you want to define your intended purpose. And why I say that, and also say claim to avoid ambiguity, you have to exclude those, because if it's ambiguous and a higher class could be determined because of that ambiguity, we will have to evaluate it in the eye of this higher class potential. So if you don't want, for example, your product that is used for testing blood to be used as a system that will determine if the blood is suitable for transfusion or not, then exclude it in your claim. That would be one way to push you down and avoid to be in the class D. Now, you have to determine the class of your product and discuss it with notified body. So we align. It makes sense now, because if you wait, you might change your sampling plan of testing, and then will present delay or require more file to be looked at. Another one, if you have list A, list B, or self-test devices, please renew those certificates to get that soft transition all the way to 2024. This is crucial. Finally, you have to prioritize your entire portfolio. Which product is key for you? Which one is okay and can wait a little bit? and so on. Why? Is because there will be a bottleneck, and then you would have to be able to communicate to notified body. These are my priorities. These are the one I can wait a little bit. And then you have to anticipate the bottleneck. And why do I say that? It's because the last information that we receive from the commission is that on the number of notified body designated, we have 4. And if you and if you look at the path, we probably have a 5th one soon. But all out of the 14 that did apply, I don't think we will have the 14 by the end of the year, and I doubt they will have the 14 by even the date of application. So this is something to think about, that you really have to look and push. On that note, I will stop here, and I guess the panel will later take any questions. Thank you.
Hello everybody, my name is Eric Vollebrecht. I am a lawyer specialized in medical technology, specifically also in IVDs, and I'm going to do a super rapid rocket presentation on economic operators and the exits under the new European medical devices regulations, one of which is the in vitro diagnostics regulation. Economic operators are important to understand because they are a novelty under the European medical devices regulation. Although under European products law they are not that new. They've actually been around since 2008 and have been phased into various European product legislations, like, for example, cosmetics, toys, and so on. And medical devices is sort of at the back of this whole process. Now, the in vitro diagnostics regulation contains a new regime, this new regime on economic operators. In the bluish gray box that you can see in the down left corner of this flowchart. It's a very helpful flowchart by MedTech Europe, which you can download from their website. This is this box in more detail, and as you can see, there are actually quite a lot of provisions with obligations for authorized representatives, importers, and distributors, all of which are economic operators under the IVDR, and manufacturers are also economic operators under the IVDR. We will quickly go through some of these obligations because we have a very short time, so we'll be very quick. What the new European economic supply chain regulation for economic operators does is basically set up a system in which each economic operator checks product compliance and regulatory compliance of the previous one, of the upstream one, as you can see in the down right corner with the graph that I've made. What is important to know about this new regime is that it will affect any existing and future distribution and supply agreements that you have for supply of products into the union, and also that the contracts need to be a lot more cooperative, because parties have to check each other's compliance. The IVDR provides that they have certain access to databases of each other with complaints data, for example. And also the IVDR imposes on the manufacturer that he must use information in the supply chain actively for post-market surveillance purposes. So that's very important. You need to have procedures for that as a manufacturer, and you will get audited on that by notified bodies. Now, crucial to understand economic operator regime is to know who is what economic operators. The systems integrator procedure pack sterilizer that I've put in on the bottom of this slide, that is only relevant to the general medical devices regulation, the sister regulation of the IVDR. But as IVD company, you might get involved with this when you are making, for example, systems or procedure packs that include an IVD and that are regulated under the MDR. Then you might become a systems integrator or procedure pack sterilizer under the MDR. Otherwise, you have the economic operators, the manufacturer, the authorized representative, the importer, and the distributor. And the importer and the distributor are differentiated in that the importer places imported devices on the market and the distributor makes them available, with placing on the market being defined as the first making available. So it's very important to understand these terms in order to be able to map your supply chain. I've put them on this slide here again. Contrary to what many people think, making available or placing on the market does not require physical handover, so it's not necessary that somebody actually touches the goods in order to qualify as an importer or a distributor under the European regulations. It is, you need an offer or agreement, which for transfer it is called, and a transfer can be basically any making the device move, to put it very descriptively. Transfers of ownership are usually deemed to be a transfer. So in case there is a transfer of ownership, even without the party involved touching the goods, the transfer between those entities is implied. So that's very important for companies that structure their supply chain separately in terms of ownership and supply of goods for tax purposes, for example. So there are a couple of documents that are really important to understand the concept of placing on the market. There is the blue guide that I've put there. That's actually the most important one. If you haven't read the blue guide or even don't know what it is, then make sure that you get this document and read it from top to bottom, because it basically explains everything. The market surveillance regulation is also an important one. That is a new regulation that enters into force on 16 July of this year. That contains additional detail for economic operator controls that are not specifically provided for in the MDR and the IVDR. So it's important to keep in mind as well. As I've said, you need a much more cooperative supply chain. You need to map the economic operators, wholesalers. They will also qualify as importers or distributors. My experience is that they always try to deny it, but even if they don't like it, they are still economic operators. There is a new regime for repackaging and relabeling in the IVDR that you need to make sure that you understand. Here is a flow chart of how this works. I'm going through this very quickly. I'm sorry for that, but we have a very little time, and my baud rate is kind of low for information transfer. But all of this, I would invite you to sit back and look at it at your leisure and sort of digest the information. We were also going to discuss the exits. We've had the Brexit end of last year. Actually, the formal Brexit already happened way earlier in 2020, but the transitional period following Brexit has expired at the end of 2020. Now we are still in a 3-month period in which customs controls are being applied very leniently, which will also end beginning of April. And I will go into all of these exits. There's a Swixit and a Turksit that are happening already for the medical devices regulation 26 May this year. So lots actually happening. If you want to know how this works with where the IVDR applies, then again, this is an excerpt from the Blue Guide that has a lot of detail on how this works for the non-EU member states that are part of the Union with a capital U for the purposes of application of the MDR. Now, Brexit, there is, as I've said, we've had Brexit. So now rather than being difficult on the inside, as a cheeky reference to Yes Minister implies here, the Brits can be try to deregulate the union from the outside now. And Brexit has a lot of consequences. Although the Brexit agreement is still not ratified by the European Parliament, it does mean that the UK is now a third country for union purposes. And what you should know about the Brexit agreement is that it does not contain any special rules for medical devices. And that means that basically UK is a full third country, so UK notified bodies are no longer union notified bodies. CE marked devices are actually not allowed on the UK market anymore, but they are tolerated by means of policy for some time. But it also means that the EU has no obligation to allow UK approved devices on the EU market unless a new mutual recognition scheme is being agreed. So that is quite important. Swixit is also, it's a complex animal. Switzerland had a mutual recognition agreement with Switzerland that only covered the medical devices directives and the IVD directives and the transitional regime for the MDR and the IVDR. There is currently a negotiated institutional framework on the agreement on the table with the EU that Switzerland basically only has to approve, but it hasn't been approved at political level, which now means that the EU is going to push Switzerland out of the Union for the purposes of MDR and IVDR, one MRA at a time. So end of May, this will happen for medical devices, and end of May next year, this will happen for IVDs. So unless the Swiss political climate changes, then the IVDR may never apply there, and then this has consequences because importers cannot be established in Switzerland, Swiss companies will need authorized representatives in the union, and so on and so forth. Turkcit, that's basically the same situation, one could say, except that there isn't a mutual recognition agreement but an association agreement, and Turkey is in the same boat as the Swiss. It seems, or at least the European Commission is saying, well, we still expect this Turkcit not to happen. There are just some personal data aspects that we need to take care of. But in the meantime, there are still no Turkish MDR and IVDR notified bodies, no EUDAMED for Turkey. And the political climate between the EU and Turkey is really quite tense. So you have to plan for the scenario that also Turkey won't be part of the union for the MDR and the IVDR. Well, how to work with the exits, we don't have time to go through that in detail, but there is quite some detail on that. It means that placing on the market cannot take place in any of the exited countries anymore because they're not part of the union. And I recommend that you take a look at the Brexit guidance for industrial products, the last updated version, which is 13 March 2020, which gives a very good rundown of all these issues. So you have to make a scenario for these situations as a company. I've put some here. If this looks like you, then you definitely need to act. And as I've said, the market surveillance regulation applies as of 16 July 2021, which is really relevant in the cases for devices. For example, if you do an online sales or if you do drop shipping straight into the EU, then, for example, one of the consequences of the market surveillance regulation is that your fulfillment service provider, the FSP, in the EU might be regulated for compliance, for example, and they might not be aware of that. So that's it. Thanks very much. Any questions, ask them in the Q&A or follow up with me on these details.
Hi, my name's Sue Spencer, and this section of the presentation is going to talk to you about what is an IVDR and also research use only and general laboratory use products and how they all fit together or don't, as the case may be. So if we actually look at the IVDR, it says that products for general laboratory use or research use only products, unless such products, in view of their characteristics especially intended by the manufacturer for in vitro diagnostic use, are actually outside the scope of the IVDR. So it has to have a special intended purpose to make it an IVD. It also says that invasive sampling devices are also outside the scope of the IVD regulation. So this would be things like needles or swabs. It's important to remember that. So at the moment, we don't have any guidance for the IVDR. However, there is guidance for the IVD directive. So you have to bear in mind this is not written for the IVDR, but it's still a good source of reference. So this MedDev 2.14/1 is about general laboratory use. And it tells us things like pipettes and centrifuges, they are just general laboratory use unless you've made some special modification for them to become an IVD. It also gives you other examples, for example, reagents for nucleic acid extraction. If they could be used for any application, for research applications, and there's no special intended purpose or change to the product to make it an IVD, they just remain as general laboratory use. Also think about things like media that could be used for environmental monitoring, for example. They're general laboratory use, they're not IVDs. And if we look at Rule 5 of the IVDR, this tells us where they fit in. So again, it reminds us this is the guidance document. It reminds us that, research use only products are normally, or should I say general laboratory use products are usually outside the scope of the IVDR, unless they are specially modified. And if they are, they fall under Rule 5 and they are Class A devices. So a little bit of a change in the accent between the IVD directive and the IVD regulation, but it clearly puts them in scope if they're specially intended for IVD applications under Rule 5, and at which point they become Class A devices. So let's just flip and look at the research use only products. So if you're an IVD, then you're either an IVD product or a product on its way to being an IVD in its performance evaluation. But if it's research use only, as a manufacturer, you generally intend that it's for basic research use only. It could be research as part of a pharmaceutical research, but this doesn't include products that would be used in a clinical pharmaceutical study for inclusion or exclusion of patient samples. At that point, we're starting to switch over to something looking much more like an IVD under the IVD regulation. So also research products that are used for identification of chemicals. So there's no IVD, no clinical application are also intended to be research use only. And then we also have materials which may be used by centralized labs to be made into their own in-house kits, at which point those tend to be products which are raw materials. But again, there's a bit of a grey area between, if you remember, the IVDs are IVD reagent products, calibrators and controls. So you have to be very careful what you claim in your intended purpose as to whether they are IVDs or their raw materials, or their actually reagent products. So if you were developing a new product, you need to think about, well, what's my intended purpose now? But also, what are my aspirations? What do I actually intend it to be in the future? Do I know now that it is going to become an IVD? Or actually, at this point, do I genuinely think it's a research use tool? So let's look at a typical pathway. So first of all, a marker is often identified. More researchers then want to be able to use this marker for their own studies. So it does become commercially available at that point, but it's still being used in a research context. But during this period, the utility of that marker starts to become established. And clinicians then may start to use it as part of their patient management, and ultimately it moves into genuine clinical practice. So if we also now start to look at what the regulatory implications are. So the researcher starts to create the reagent. Then the manufacturer starts to sell it as a research use only product, so it's available to other researchers. Then it may continue at this point to be research use only because the manufacturer is making no clinical claims at this point. But they should also not be promoting it for clinical applications. So at this point, we're now moving into a point where clinical decisions might be being made on the basis of this product. So the claims made by the manufacturer have to be really tightly controlled. Do you intend it to be an IVD, or do you still intend it to be used for those research applications before finally it moves into being an IVD itself? So at this point, we have the danger zone, at which point you're switching over between a research use only product and actually being moved into clinical applications. So there are a couple of tests that you need to consider. First of all, what do you write in your intended purpose? And the claims that you make for the product more generally, that includes those handy YouTube clips that you have. Who do you sell it to? So if you're claiming it's for research use only, but you only sell it to hospitals, then again, it's suggesting that actually we've now moved over into it being an IVDR. And as I had said, also you have to look holistically at it. So what claims do I make? Who do I sell it to? And more generally, what do the claims around the product that I make look like? So remember, if you are the manufacturer, and a lot of this we've been talking about so far says that if intended by the manufacturer. So if you are the manufacturer, you have to take responsibility for the whole device. So there used to be the ability to go piggyback on somebody else's CE mark, but that no longer exists. So we no longer have own brand labeled or private labeled devices. So that means you have to hold the full technical documentation. You need to have a quality management system that meets the requirements of the IVD regulation. And you're responsible for the design and also design changes of the device. So if someone else is manufacturing that product for you, you'll still have to sign off on the design, any design changes, and you are also responsible for the manufacturing that they conduct on your behalf. It also means that you need to make arrangements for post-market surveillance, including post-market performance follow-up, and also vigilance. So ultimately, you draw up your declaration conformity, which is where you're saying you meet all of those above requirements. You also need to remember that if you are using a third party to do any key design or manufacturing for you, they may require a notified body audit. And that would also include unannounced audits. So it's really important that you select appropriate subcontractors, and also that in the contracts that you have with them, that you have appropriate arrangements made so that any notified body or competent authority can audit them if required. So this is my last slide, and it's a bit of a teaser really for what's coming next. So in the final of these series that we have, we're going to talk much more about CDXs and also laboratory developed tests. So in the US, we also have laboratory developed tests, which kind of fit in the middle between that research use only moving into clinical application. Now, under the IVD regulation, we don't actually have that facility. It's covered by something called distance sales. But as I say, I'm going to kind of leave you wanting more and tell you that the next in the series of webinars that we're running here is going to talk about that in much more detail. So kind of hold your questions on that until next time, and we'll answer those in much more detail. So we'll have questions on this subject at the end of all the presentations.
So we've had a few questions come in already. And the first one is from someone who has a near patient test and will be continuing to sell reagents for a legacy instrument, which will be discontinued from the 26th of May, 2022. And the question is follows: the reagents will need to be reviewed for the near patient application. What information will the notified body want to see about the instrument in the reagent technical file? For example, will the notified body want to see from the near patient studies performed on the instrument? Will they want to see any other data for the instrument? Julian, could you provide your thoughts on this?
Yeah, hi. So that's a very good question, and we have to go back to I will go to the essence of the regulation. And if you think about it, you will, in the case your instrument is also a Class A device, so that the instrument or the software running the instrument doesn't perform any form of analysis or so on. So just to be sure that there's a Class A. And in that case, for the reagent, we will look at the performance of the reagent according to the way it is to be used. So if you look at the performance evaluation that you have to perform, you have the scientific validity, the analytical performance, and the clinical performance. And the clinical performance have to be the use of your device, so in that case, the reagents, with the intended within the intended purpose, with the intended users, and basically, I like to say it in situ. So in that case, it will be run on your device. So we don't have to have part of your evaluation of the instrument, but we will have to see that the performance have been performed on that instrument, and that will be the way that we'll evaluate how the performance was done. An addition that we need to do is you please describe in the description of your reagent that if it has to be used with that specific analyzer or instrument, then it's important for you to identify such instrument. That's how far that it goes, considering the instrument in the Class A device.
Perfect, thank you very much. And as a follow-up question, we have a question for Eric. If we have a vigilance case or field action that relates to the legacy instrument post-May 2022, would we have to report? Should the strategy for legacy devices be documented in the strategy for regulatory compliance, Article 10.8a?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Great. I have quite some technical issues. So anyway, yes, of course, if it's a legacy device which is on the market post DAVE application, then the vigilance application, the vigilance requirements still apply. So if it's a legacy device in the way that the legacy devices term is used, so that means a device with a pre-date of application CE certificate that is on the market between 2022 and 2024 under Article 110, Section 3 of the IVDR, then definitely you need to engage in vigilance, and also vigilance by the IVDR standard, because that is one of the requirements in Article 110, Section 3. And insofar as the strategy for regulatory compliance must be made for the device based on the old rules for the device, because you haven't CE marked it under the MDR then yet, then definitely the strategy for regulatory compliance based on ISO 13485, for example, should include precisely doing this. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Our next question is for Julian, and it is as follows. The MDCG issued guidance on SSCP, which states that you can only have one basic UDI per SSP. There is currently no IVD guidance. Would the NB expect a separate SSP for a reagent cartridge and another for the associated controls? As the data to support the performance of the devices has been performed as part of the same study, can these be combined into one technical file?
So there will be an SSP guidance coming for IVD. So whatever I might say here could be changed, but depending on the guidance to come out. But one thing that we have to look at is if you look at the basic UDI and then going back to that and how that basic UDI DI is associated. And one of the elements has to be the same intended purpose, the same manufacturing processes, the same class. And basically, if you look at all of those and you consider, and again, this is only on the case where calibrators and control are associated with the product, they have to have the same class as the reagent. So if you talk about unassigned control, it's different. They would have to have their own SSP in a way. But if you talk about the one that goes with an assay, then they basically have the same class. So if we base on that principle, they may also have exactly the same basic UDI DI, and in that case, they will be combined. But again, if there is a huge difference that you use it on an assay control, in that case, that control will have a life on its own. So it's all a matter if they are together or not. That's the way I see it today.
Excellent, thank you very much. And another question for you here is, some manufacturers experience difficulty getting contacts from notified bodies, even though they are ready to submit because of capacity issues. Could you provide an update on the current position?
Yeah, well, the point is we have 4 notified bodies as of today that are designated for IVDR, probably a 5th one in a few months, maybe 6, we'll see. But one thing that you can imagine is that all of these notified bodies already have discussed with their current client base and have made plans. So now we are pretty much a year before the date of application. A lot of the plans are into place. So even if you're ready to submit, if you don't have a notified body today, it might not be able to accept the submission today. It might be able to accept the submission in 3-6 months or so. And when you say you're ready to submit, is it you're ready to submit like basically, on the next month? Because one thing happening is a lot of people were ready to submit and now the date is moving. And as of today, I can tell you that the peak of the request will come in a mid-year, so in a couple of months. And after that, it will get more and more difficult to get somebody done before the end of the year because there will be already a lot of requests in. So if I know it's difficult with a notified body, contact us. Let's talk about the plan. Let's see what is available as of today. I mean, I know we're taking clients right now. It will also depend on what kind of product we're talking about. But it's a bottleneck that we were expecting that is actually coming very fast and very hard. One thing for sure, if we cannot take you now, please try to see if we can take you like soon, if it's not now, and allow you to be in the queue, because it's very important for you to be in the queue. Don't wait to try to find a spot right away.
Excellent, thank you very much. So our next question is for Sue, and it is as follows. My company buys IHC antibodies from a manufacturer in the US, which are not CE marked, and we use them for clinical applications. Will we need to CE mark them under the IVDR?
So ultimately, someone's going to have to take responsibility for the CE marking activity. So either the manufacturer, if they're importing them into Europe, and they're selling them for that application, are going to have to take responsibility, or alternatively, as you're changing the intended purpose, if really they genuinely intend to just sell these as a biotech product and now you're changing the intended purpose, then unfortunately you become responsible. But then that means you get everything that comes with it. You have to have the technical file, and you also have to have an appropriate quality management system as well.
Excellent, thank you. And does your response go some way to answer this next question? Can products such as pipette tips, which are CE IVD marked for use in diagnostics kits, for example, also be sold to R&D users and non-diagnostics customers in general?
Yeah, so that's a little bit of the coming into general laboratory use. They could be general laboratory use and therefore outside the scope of the IVD regulation altogether. And therefore, yes, in that case, you're perfectly at liberty to sell them to IVD manufacturers, biotech, people doing QC in food manufacturing, etc. However, if you have changed them in some way or you've made it has some special characteristic, which means that they have a special characteristic which enables them to be specifically used for an IVD application, then they become effectively accessories. And in that case, they would fall under Rule 5 and they would be Class A devices.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Our next question is for Eric, and it is, you only hear about Swiss MRA for medical devices ending on the 26th of May 2021. Does this mean that MRA for IVDs ends on that date too?
Yeah, it's a good question. By the way, before I answer this, I can't emphasize enough what Julian just said about getting in the queue for an IVD notified body. Actually, we are seeing this now with only a month to go before the MDR date of application. Lots of software companies, for example, waited until the last moment. They are missing out. So really heed Julian's advice there. So let me just have made that point. With regards to the Swixit, yeah, that's an interesting one, and I realized that also my slides may not have been completely clear on that, because the Swixit is basically it's a two-step process, if you will, for first for medical devices. So that will happen by the date of application of the MDR, which is 26 May. This year, so next month, literally. If the Swiss have not signed the IFA, the international frame, the institutional framework agreement by then, they will be pushed out of the union for the MDR. But the MRA with Switzerland covers also in vitro diagnostics directive, which remains in force until the IVDR becomes applicable, and that happens next year. So if it takes Switzerland 1 year more to sign the institutional framework agreement for IVDs, before the IVDR, then again Switzerland might be pushed out of the union also for IVDs. So there is this year where Switzerland is not part of the union for medical devices, but is for IVDs basically, if things are going the way it looks. So that's an important one, and that's why you never hear anybody about the Swixit for IVDs yet. But this might be happening next year if the political situation continues the way it does. So it's definitely still one to watch for IVD companies, even if it's not right on your doorstep at the moment. Which is what they thought about medical devices a year ago as well. The Swixit is still a year away, and now it's less than a month away, and it's going to happen.
Perfect, thank you for that. And a actual follow-up question for you. I sell directly online from an OUS EU manufacturer to my customers in the EU. So why should I care about the economic operator rules in the IVDR? I have no importer and I have no distributor. So what is the problem?
Well, that's also a question that I quite often hear from clients in China and the US, for example. And there they should realize there was also one of the elements mentioned in my presentation, is that as of July this year, the market surveillance regulation applies regulation 1020/2019. And that has a provision in there that says that if you are a legal manufacturer selling to end users directly in the EU without having an entity that is qualifies as an importer or a distributor, then if there is not a fulfillment service provider in the EU taking responsibility for a number of elements that otherwise the importer would take responsibility for, these are listed in that regulation, then you are not allowed to place a product on the market. So in the scenario that you've mentioned in the question, the legal manufacturer would actually need to amend his agreement with his 3PL in Europe, because otherwise the sale is illegal. And that is a very important point that will start playing when the market surveillance regulation enters into force. And that's also something many companies are not aware of. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. Our next question is for Sue, and it is, if an IVD at this present time is declared under IVDD Annex 8 whilst being used in a clinical trial, but no clinical claims because the clinical claim is still under investigation, would this assay then be considered an RUO under IVDR?
Well, effectively, you've declared it an IVD if you're using Annex 8 of the IVD directive. Now, during a transition period, you always have a choice. You can either use the IVD directive or you can use the IVD regulation. So it kind of sounds like in this situation that you've chosen to use the IVD directive. But then that means at that point you've kind of decided that it is an IVD, so it isn't really a research use only. I know this gets quite complicated where you've got devices that may be used as part of a pharma study, for example, and is it used for inclusion or exclusion? Then at that point, you'd certainly under the IVDR have additional requirements, but sometimes there are also tests which might be used just to confirm the biochemistry of the patient and isn't for inclusion and exclusion. And so these tests aren't necessarily intended sometimes to be placed on the market as IVDs and are just tools which are used as part of the pharma study and therefore approved as part of the pharma study and are never intended to be placed on the market. So I think in my presentation I used the word about what you aspire to be, because really back at the beginning you have to really decide, am I really going to stay as research use only? Could I potentially switch over into being an IVD? Is it something that's going to be used as a CDX? Is it something that could be used as part of a distance sale centralized lab situation? And then make sure that you use the appropriate vehicle. For example, if it's an IVD, it's either going to be Annex 8 under the IVD directive or Annex 13 under the regulation. So you really kind of have to plan ahead and look at the strategy for that.
Excellent, thank you. So my next question, I believe, will be for Eric, but please feel free, anyone else who'd like to jump in. Per the centralized model of EOs, if the manufacturer and importer are part of the same legal entity and have the same QMS, can verification of product per Article 13 be performed prior to shipping by the manufacturer on behalf of the importer?
Well, I can say something about that, but maybe Sue or Julian, you want to say something about this?
I'll leave it to you if you go ahead.
Well, it is possible actually, because and for people that are interested in how exactly, because it's kind of a long story, I wrote a detailed article about it. Basically, what you do is if you're in the same corporate group, what you can do is you can include a procedure in the quality system that allows the importer to do part of the importer verification. Basically, to subcontract that if you were under a quality agreement or in a quality system procedure to the manufacturer. So that allows, for example, to some companies that I know have a group-wide SAP system. And what they do, for example, is they have a procedure that is backed by IT in the SAP system that provides that the manufacturer can only ship products to the European importer, of which the manufacturer has checked for the importer that they meet the verification criteria in Article 13, Section 2. So is CE marked, IFU is there, things like that, product is compliant. So that is definitely possible. It's you need to do it intelligently, but and also you would need to provide for an audit mechanism so you can really show that the importer is control of this procedure and verifies that by means of auditing that the procedure works. But it's totally possible.
I think sometimes the confusion can come in that some manufacturers, particularly large manufacturers, have a distribution warehouse, but actually they don't act as a distributor. They really act as a freight forwarder. And then there is a distributor who's actually in maybe each of the different member states that actually does the distributor activity. And the distribution warehouse literally just ships it in and ships it out. So sometimes the confusion can be in terms of, as you say, you've got to map out, and it's not as easy as it sounds. You need to make sure you map out so everybody knows who's doing what to whom and who's wearing the importer hat and who's wearing the distributor hat.
Definitely. Yeah, it's a bit like going sailing also, because you also have to explain it to your internal tax and logistics people who will, and you will quickly find out when you go down that road, will actually interpret the concepts of importer and distributor in a completely different way than they are defined under the MDR. So that's also to supplement Sue on this, that makes this mapping out internally even more difficult. Actually, before this webinar, I was working on integration of a company after a merger, which is now being integrated with another company, and it's just total confusion because nobody understands how the other supply chain works and how they should do this for MDR. So it is a lot of work, as Sue says. And you need to genuinely understand what these concepts mean. So the reference in my presentation about the blue guide is very important, because in my experience, not everybody is very well acquainted with the blue guide, then starts interpreting the MDR and the IVDR basically just on their face. That usually doesn't lead to the best interpretation. So it's really it is a project, as Sue said.
Excellent, thank you for that. So we've got time for just one more question, and I'll put this to Julian, and that's, how long is the technical file valid if it's created under MDD?
Well, is as valid as actually, that's a very good question. Whatever is created under, it doesn't really matter, knowing that the technical documentation is a living document. So if it was started maybe 20 years ago, you technically were supposed to keep it up to date with any change, with any post-market and so on. So it is still valid if it's kept up to date. It's not valid if it's not kept up to date. But that would be the same thing under IVDR. If you make under IVDR, it's not because you make it for the initial that you cannot afterward have nothing to do, leave it on the shelf. It has to be kept updated. So as long as you keep that update, it will be valid.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So thank you, everyone. That's all we have time for today. So thank you for your excellent presentations and discussions at the end. And thank you for everyone joining us online and for sending in your questions.